to me is there's not very few activities you do without some sort of agenda of trying to get something or manipulate something or trying to deceive. It's one of the few times where you are completely going within yourself to try to uncover some sort of truth, some sort of higher awareness, to get some perspective on yourself and on your life. And it's always been really quite beautiful to me. It really is only through changing yourself to the best of your ability that I believe anything improves, whether in the world or I guess in any situation to some degree is always a reflection of your own, what they would call karma. So based off of your past actions, past thoughts, past deeds, you have a certain set of circumstances in your life. And the idea, especially from a perspective of karma, is that if you want to change your life, you need to change your karma. And that any other attempt at trying to force something through greed or through anger or through maybe even like a quick fix. So an example might be, there might be some way to steal money from people and deceive them in order to become rich very quick. While that may work in the material realm for a while, you would basically work up a karmic deficit. Yeah. Have a seat. Hello. Yeah. And thank you for joining us. So, as I was saying about karma, that there's many ways and maybe you can get rich quickly, but from the perspective of karma, anything that was done or obtained through means other than personal purification, goodwill, helping others, is basically seen as temporary. And there'll always be some type of karmic deficit of some type built up that you'll then have to pay back sooner or later. And so, one of the main things I've been thinking a lot about is trying to figure out how to be in the world but not of it, which is kind of a Christian thing as far as I think that specific languaging kind of comes from the Bible, but it's just as much Buddhist or Hindu in the sense that we need to obviously act in the world, but the more that we cling to it, the more that eventually that will lead to suffering. And trying to find a balance between what you can do that is good, what you have available to you maybe mentally to keep a certain mindset, because even if you have very good intentions, maybe you're under a certain amount of stress, it would be too much for you, and maybe you would make decisions that would negatively impact you in the long term. This is one of the reasons why I don't think it's really wise for everybody to be a monk, but only certain people when they're ready to become a monk. Because that lifestyle can be quite demanding if you're not ready for it. the way that I usually like to set these up is do a little bit of talking, present some ideas, and then go into a 30-minute meditation, and then kind of leave the last part open for either questions or to bring up a certain topic, whatever that might be, and kind of discuss it. And so I think for this time, really, this kind of idea of being in the world but not of it, how to interact in the world without becoming attached to the world, or to act in the way that might be best, they basically allow you to gain the most merit, is I think what I'm going to have the topic for this evening's meditation be. And so, if everyone could just kind of close their eyes. You want to, when you meditate, try to keep your back straight, head straight, all of it aligned. I like to keep my fingers crossed personally, but there's many styles and I always believe it's a little bit arbitrary. It's mostly about, can you sit in this position for longer and longer periods of time without having pain? Because if you're hunched or your legs are not at the proper angles, a lot of times you can damage yourself in the long term. And so I have pretty flexible hips and I've done a lot of meditation, so I can kind of sit half lotus fairly comfortably, but cross-legged is fine, or if that's even too hard, a lot of people can put their foot kind of even in front of them, so it can be this kind of open stance where one leg's forward and one leg's back, so you don't have weight one on top of the other. And of course, if that's too hard, there's always chairs. One of the things that helps quite a lot with meditation is breathing deeply. There's a lot of techniques that actually, instead of following the breath at the nose, they follow the rising and falling of the abdomen area. And just kind of allowing yourself to breathe deeply all the way in with your stomach fully extended, and then all the way out. With your stomach kind of sucked all the way in. Kind of allows you to breathe the deepest. But eventually, instead of controlling the breathing, I'm still a believer in breathing naturally. And that a lot of the breathing techniques are really more to get us to breathe naturally, because people tend to have a very tight, a very shallow breath because of stress or whatever, and it makes the breath very tight. So always taking a couple deep breaths all the way in. All the way out. All the way in. All the way out. One more time. All the way in. All the way out. Relaxing the shoulders. With every breath, try to relax a little bit deeper. Allowing ourselves to acknowledge that whatever stresses of the day, whatever worry, anxiety that we've had about whatever issue. For this period of time, you want to put that all aside. You want to try to be present and get in touch with the fact that in this moment, everything is fine. Anxiety, fears are always about the future, something happening that we don't want. And so if we just practice bringing our attention to the present, and allow us for a second to just recognize the sacredness of the present moment, we can start to get in touch with something deeper, something silent, something without some type of agenda. If we're ever to be happy, we must free ourselves from the dependency on the world, dependency on things, people, places, by allowing ourselves to draw happiness, peace from a different source. And in meditation, we try to discover that source. Watch as the mind shifts. Notice how as the mind shifts, your mood also shifts. And then perhaps as your mood shifts, your mind reacts. Perhaps the body reacts. Perhaps there's other subtler aspects that you may be aware of also reacting. Meditation and spirituality is not about having someone tell you what to believe. It's about being able to look inside and see for yourself what's true and what's not true. While there are wise men before us that have come and given guidance, at the end of the day, you have to discover it for yourself in order for it to be ultimately true. If there's some pain or discomfort, try to just observe it before reacting, to create sort of like a buffer of some type. And you'll see by just having that little buffer how reactive the mind is. And that little bit of awareness will start to grow until you can learn to start to relax more and more into whatever you're experiencing. Try to look and see at the things that you are attached to in the world. What things in the world are you trying to control? And how much stress does it cause? Anxiety, worry. What are the justifications that are used? A lot of times there can be a belief that if I don't worry or I'm not stressed about this thing, X or Y won't happen. The promise of enlightened sages, beings that have walked the spiritual path before us, is that there is a way to be happy, ultimately happy and free. And this is what we strive for. If there's sounds that you find distracting or some sensation that's distracting, just remember this is the meditation. Meditation is not about having a perfect environment where you feel good about all the time. Meditation is a discipline of the mind. A cultivation of the mind, of goodwill, of being present. Discovering truth for ourselves. order to let go of attachment, you have to let go of the thing you believe you will get if you are attached. It's also talked about in the Bhagavad Gita, where it talks about letting go of the fruit of action. There's always some justification we make up for attachment, for craving. When I say attachment, I don't even mean attachment and say attachment to, say, doing good deeds for other or detaching from that, but detachment in the sense of there being some type of craving. And that this craving leads to some form of mental suffering, some form of mental unhappiness, because it tells us that reality is not how we want it to be. What would it be like to be in the world without needing anything from anybody? To be completely self-content. The freedom we ultimately crave is the freedom from ourself and our mind. Our minds are untrained, undisciplined. And so now it's wonderful we're taking time to at least become aware. Because if we are aware of how the mind functions, we'll naturally start orientating ourselves and our mind towards a more healthy pattern. Because no one wishes to suffer. It's all done through ignorance. be in the world but not of it, we have to stop wanting things from the world. The world can ultimately never satisfy us. Even if someone gets what they desire, the desire tends to just look for the next thing because it's desiringness itself. That's the problem. We're all influenced by another, our surroundings and who we hang out with and what we see on our phones. And they all feed our attachments, cravings and desires, because that's how they keep our attention, keep their power, how we give our power away. This world itself has a certain level of consciousness, a certain way of being. And so to be liked by this level of consciousness and this way of being, you have to act and be according to how it says you should act and be, which a lot of the time is not in your own best interest, especially if what you crave or are looking for is some sort of spiritual truth. And yet this world serves a purpose for those who choose to search for truth, choose to take back control of their minds, to not be reactive. How to be in the world but not of it. It is possible to be a monk and have many attachments still. And it's possible to be a lay person and to be free. All of it will depend upon your own intention and actions. Expect your mind to fight back. Whatever or however it usually acts, it prefers to act. It's become conditioned in that way. This is why patience is such a huge part of the path. Patience to allow yourself to feel uncomfortable. As your mind starts to be given new orders. This is the direct path to becoming happy. Direct path to love. A love that's there not because you did something, because you're favored in some type of way. A love that's there because at the core, underneath all the anxiety, all the fear, just with beingness itself, there's a love that radiates. The only true love in the universe. Everything in the universe will change. Anicca. Just the Pali word. People will change. Relationships change. Our job will change, or lack thereof. What's popular, what's not popular, will change. Every moment someone is dying and someone is reborn. What does it look like to be in the world but not of it? Use that as a place to look from. really trying to obtain the perfect answer. We're trying to contemplate the question, to go deeply into what it is to be, to let go. The difference between that and ourselves, and how we usually think all these things. Just allow yourself to be in that space. What does it look like to be in the world without attachment? A lot of times people think that without attachment, perhaps they would give away all their money or do something that would somehow leave them in a situation where they themselves wouldn't be able to be taken care of. But I've found that usually it's quite the opposite. When the mind calms and your needs are taken care of, usually the first thing that comes to mind is taking care of the needs of others. Or perhaps there's attachment to a certain view, a negative view of ourselves. Maybe there's things that need to be taken care of, such as one's health or one's mind. Just 3 more minutes. One last deep breath. Let it all the way out. And slowly allow yourself to relax your posture, open up, move around a little bit as you see fit. Okay, hope that was all right for everybody. So now I always like to just open it up to any question, any topic, anything on anybody's mind, or we can just sit here in silence. It's all fine with me. Have we met before? No. My name's Manu. TJ. Nice to see you. Yeah. I think everyone's been here before. I know them personally.
One question. So the Buddha says life is a suffering?
It says dukkha. There's a lot of interpretations to dukkha. Suffering is usually the one that's used, but it doesn't have to be extreme, because it can also mean like anxiety or stress or very subtle things. It's basically, the idea is that there's not a sense of peace or comfort that we normally have, and that shows up as you would encompass suffering, which would mean anything that is basically not being at peace, more or less.
Okay. So how do you find that?
So, Eightfold Noble Path would basically be the way, but I mean, just to put it in short, I guess, ultimately we have attachments, cravings. So there's things that we have that we don't want, and then things that we want that we don't have. And as long as this is the way the mind functions, you can never be happy. And so, by becoming aware of our attachments and learning to retrain the mind to accept the way reality is, and there's kind of three main principles that I always kind of liked, which is dukkha, anicca, and anatta. So dukkha being like that there is suffering, that's the first noble truth as well. Anatta being that usually what we take for as us or me is actually a combination of different parts. So we have the mind. Usually most people, especially Westerners, we think of ourselves as the mind. And so one of the main things is to see that the mind is actually something that's kind of like functions of its own. It's its own machine. It has its own logic kind of built in. And that it's fundamentally not us, because we can observe it. And you cannot observe that which is you. And this observer quality of the mind, or there's something which is beyond the mind. And even with enlightenment or nirvana, it's all kind of predicated on this idea that there's something beyond, our limited individualistic mind that's helped in underlining the universe, whatever that is. And it has to be something that can't be explained or compared, but something only through direct experience can you fundamentally understand the nature of the universe, so to speak. So the Buddha didn't get into things about is there a God or isn't there a God. He basically said there's no point to debate any of these things. The only thing that's really there that's worth talking about is your suffering, and how do we get you to stop suffering. And then once you stop suffering, you'll understand how things are, and then from there, you're good.
The Buddha is trying to find the reason for the suffering, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think the reason for suffering in my way is that the people, we just structure each other.
Because we what each other?
Torture each other.
Talk to. Torture. Oh, okay.
We are fundamentally bad in our mind. I'm not sure, but somehow we try to make each other feel bad in any different way.
Yeah, I think it's not.
It doesn't really matter how you try to help them. Even if you try to help people, they will think he has some agenda behind it, and they will think something bad about it.
Sure. Well, you can't change anyone that doesn't want to be changed, right? So if there's someone else, even like your mother, you care so much about, right?
Only the mother.
Yeah. Just for example, especially the mother. So if you try to change someone, right, a lot of times it's, you know, I believe everyone is really, it's up to us to save ourselves to a certain degree, and then with what we learn, sometimes we can help others and sometimes you can't. Like even you could have the best therapist in the world, right?
My point is that, so you try yourself, but everybody is around you like that. You can't help just feel, stressed, angry.
Well, have you noticed some people feel more angry and stressed and some people feel less angry and stressed?
I do.
Yeah, so it's not so much the person, right? Because if there's people that are more stressed and less stressed from the same person, then it must be something about the way that person thinks, right? So if some stranger comes up to me, you know, I'll have very little reaction. Why? Because there's very little attachment. I don't have a lot of story around who they are and what they mean to me. But if someone I care about, like a very close friend, says something to me, maybe I become very hurt. And a lot of it is because we have this certain view of ourselves. We call this, like, this is kind of the ego thing. We have this, we want everyone to have a perfect image of us, like we're a perfect Buddha in everybody's mind. And a lot of times, if they say or do something, then we react to it internally because we want them to think highly of us or think good, or maybe they say something, we don't like it. But it's always us reacting internally and comparing our view of ourselves to what they're saying. And so if you're able to basically see your own mind react in this way, you can be free. Because like if I called you I'll give you one quick example. If I called you a purple elephant, you wouldn't get very offended because it would be kind of ridiculous, you know, like, in the same way, it's because we make it mean something about us. We believe it has some sort of truth. Because it has some sort of truth, what they say or how they act, or we want them to act differently because we are controlling them, then this creates the suffering. But the thing is, we have very strong patterns, right? And most people, unless you do a lot of meditation, you're not used to just being able to change your mind by looking at your mind. This is kind of a very, even in the West, I mean, a lot of it is like, you know, all of our solutions are external. Someone talks badly to you, maybe you talk to them and you try to explain, okay, stop talking to me this way, I don't like it. And that's all fine, and maybe sometimes that works. But at the end of the day, sometimes it doesn't work. And so unless you can really end up becoming secure with yourself, like let's say, you know, you don't have any insecurities, you feel very good about your intelligence, your looks, everything, right? Someone could come say something to you, just be like, oh, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He said I'm ugly, but I know I'm so gorgeous and amazing, and it doesn't even affect you, right? So, and a lot of times too, it's even deeper because it's clinging to the ideas. So maybe you have a thing of like, if you say, oh, I'm ugly, and you're okay being ugly, there's no problem if someone calls you ugly, right? Because you already accept it. Okay, I'm not that good looking. It's okay, I have this dimple, I'm a little bit fat, I'm a little chubby here. It's okay. And so a lot of times we don't accept a lot of stuff about ourselves, and we want people to do or act a certain way. So at the end of the day, it's us. Because you can be peaceful around a whole bunch of people. Even like our teacher, Sayadaw Ottamasar, because that's his picture, and he's from Myanmar. I don't know if you're familiar with him at all. Yeah, he's a monk from Myanmar or Burma, you know, he's probably one of the most detached people because he's helped many sick people and built hospitals and deals with elderly and all the drug addicts and all these people that no one else wants to deal with. And he basically brought them and started building centers where they could live. And this is one of them even. We have like some homeless people that live in the back, or even people that are addicted to drugs, kind of help in our own way to try to, you know, give them a space to recover as best they can. And, but he's someone that is definitely very peaceful despite being around a lot of chaos. A lot of people with very major problems, very angry, lashing out, but, you know, he cares. And when you start caring about other people too, because you feel more and more happy with yourself, you know, there's, I think, you know, I was a monk for almost, I was a monk for about 15 months. And during that time, I really realized that, you know, I didn't care about myself nearly as much as I thought I did. And it was only by becoming kind of back integrated with society and caring more about other people and being able to do more for others that I even started to feel, how to say, like, I started to feel like my life had more meaning. I started feeling better about my spiritual growth, I guess, and that I could continue to grow versus it just being about me and trying to escape too. Because also with Buddhism, you know, especially, it can seem a lot of times about escapism for people who maybe aren't as familiar with some of the ideas, because it can seem like, oh, you become a monk, you run away from everything, and all your problems are fixed. But yeah, I know. But in reality, you take all your problems with you. And if your problem is not your mother, then it's going to be the head teacher at the monastery. It's going to be your neighbor in your kuti, in your small little hut. You'd be surprised. I mean, I think a lot of times, you know, especially if you're very mental, I think a lot of times, you know, I remember there was this famous monk in Burma. I wish I could remember his name, but I remember reading this book about him. And he went off and lived by himself, like in the mountains for like 10 years or something like that. And a lot of monks have kind of attempted to do this, and when he came back, they asked him, well, how was it? You know, who else did you meet? Did you meet any enlightened sages? And he's like, oh, I met one other wise man, but he met, like, everyone else he met had just gone insane for the most part. Because if you don't have training of the mind, the Buddha talks about this too in the Nikayas or the Buddha Suttas, where unless you can basically already be disciplined in the world, you're not going to be able to do it when you go off into the forest. And a lot of the monastic stuff is, you know, you can get lost in a world of fantasy just as much. I mean, I used to think people who meditated could meditate for very long periods of time. It must mean they're enlightened or superior. But then you start to meet these people, and a lot of times they have just as many problems as other people, because it's not so much about how long can you sit there, but how much can you detach. And a lot of times you can sit in silence or be by yourself for a very long time, and you just live in your own fantasy world. You know, you see a lot of people who've lost their minds on the streets, and maybe they don't have any friends, and they're just in their own world, and they're not really happy, but they can still deal with just being by themselves, you know.
They talk to themselves.
Well, if people are like schizophrenic or have a lot of the mental issues and stuff, you know, a lot of times on the streets, you know, you would get that type of behavior, but it's only really by consciously trying to overcome our attachments that you'll ever overcome them. It's not about, you know, I mean, being a monk has its benefits, because a lot of times if you separate the things from you that you're very attached to, the attachment will decrease, and this is true. You know, so if someone's always fighting with their mother, for example, and they detach and go somewhere else away from their mother, maybe that stress will go down, right? And maybe they learn a little bit more balance, and maybe if they come back, it won't be as bad. But at the end of the day, you're never going to be able to completely overcome it, because the pattern of the mind fundamentally is to become attached.
So we're trying to become relaxed. You know, everybody around you is like going crazy, angry, and somehow it affects you, and at the end, you stress again.
Well, the thing is,
For example, I never noticed before, but I stopped eating the meat, like a medical reason, couple 6-7 months ago. Then I realized how people are so angry. I never noticed it before, because I think I was one of them. And I just realized people are generally so much stressed and angry. And I feel, you know, fine. I can, you know, these people are great. Yeah. But at the end, still it makes me, you know, stressed a little bit.
yeah.
Stressed out.
So I would say two things about that. One is I do believe in protecting yourself to some degree, because until you master what I'm talking about with the meditation and gaining more and more control over the mind, you're always going to be subject to outside influences. This is why coming to a meditation like this, right, we influence each other to try to look more inside, to have these conversations that help me as much as you. And, you know, being around, say, a certain type of community with certain intention, all these things, right, eating a certain way, all these things impact us. But the thing is to realize that as we become more and more, like, say, advanced, you know, that these things there's a way of using them too. Like if something's very triggering to me, I can use that and say, oh, okay, well, what am I very attached to that this is so triggering to me? Right? So what did my friends say, or what is their attitude, right? Because maybe it could be very general, and sometimes it is. But sometimes too, you know, a lot of times it's like maybe the reason why when you interact with your family or something, the reason why it's so hard for someone would be because they have a certain way in which they want their family to act, and they're not acting that way. And maybe they don't realize that because it's very subtle. And so if we can start looking at all the ways in which these things impact us, we'll start seeing where we're weak mentally. Because if you fundamentally have no attachments, and there'll be no way for these things to affect you.
So mental exercise.
Yeah, which is basically meditation, really, is like a mental exercise. It's also, I mean, it gets very subtle, because in the beginning it's maybe even more of remembering. You know, to me also a lot of spirituality is about remembering truth, because even the things I tell you, maybe a lot of times, maybe something you haven't thought about before, but a lot of times we know this, know things in the back of our head, because I think all people have this like other side that's also very wise, you know, and so getting in touch with that wisdom and that knowledge, so we can remember, oh, okay, I want to detach from this instead of reacting, right? And whatever spiritual, and this is like the idea of keeping these ideas, right? Like today I was talking about being in the world but not of it, or being attached to the world, right? So you take that idea and you try to look at all the ways that you're attached, and the same way when you feel something and it makes you very angry, you can look at it and say, okay, well, why is this making me so angry? Because it's always going to be, it always takes two. It always, like, you know, it takes two to tango, they say, right? So it's going to be something about you. Maybe they're angry, but it's also because of something about you.
So I get very angry sometimes, not all the time.
Mm-hmm.
When people, they say they're gonna do something, and they just ignore it.
Mm.
So when someone is ignoring you, that makes me sometimes really angry.
Yeah.
Do you understand what I'm trying to say? My English is not.
No, I understand. And I would say.
Today I was at the work.
Mm-hmm.
I was waiting to drop off the cars there, and they said they're gonna take it. At 5 o'clock, they just said one close,
Mm.
and we waited there for 2 hours.
Oh wow.
So I just go, what the fuck are you talking about? I called their boss.
Yeah. And so.
So people are so inconsiderate to each other.
So I think a lot of it is when we understand too, like, you know, almost everybody here that's a human, right, has flaws, and they do a lot of things. Because I'm sure if it was, you know, if he thought about it as if you were like his family, he would never do that, right? So there's some always disconnect usually with people about how they view the world, because I'm explaining it in too complicated of a way, but how to say, like, the reason it's okay to be mad about things when they don't work out the way you want them to, right? Like, to a certain extent, there's going to be a certain reaction, and to know.
That's the one. I think when things doesn't work out the way it is, it makes me angry.
Yeah.
I think that's the one.
And so there's an attachment, right? So we have an idea in our mind. When I go to this car dealer, he is going to act this way, right? And we have an attachment to that instantly. I think he's going to act this way because tar dealers or whoever they are supposed to act this way. But who says they are supposed to act this way?
No one said.
Yeah.
It's in my mind. I said to
Yeah.
myself,
Exactly. And then you suffer also.
and I suffer myself.
Uh-huh. And in the same way, so if it's like, oh, well, you know, people are flawed and they do flawed things. But the thing is, even for myself, I have stuff that I'm struggling with too. So it's not like